The Anglo-Saxons were the ancestors of the modern English ethnic group, a collection of closely related Western Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Frisians, who migrated to Britain during the 5th century after the end of Roman government in the region. A 2016 study by Schiffels and colleagues looked at DNA of 10 Anglo-Saxon skeletons and found that on average, modern English people took about 38% of their DNA from such people. A forthcoming study from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History may yield different results. In a talk on their yet-to-be-published findings, they revealed that they had genome sequences from over 80 Anglo-Saxon skeletons, and when compared to the numerous samples of earlier British skeletons acquired from other studies, they found that approximately 80% of British ancestry was replaced in England during the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasions. This enormous genetic replacement helps to explain how a formerly Romanized Celtic-speaking region, which was Christian, suddenly abandoned its language in favour of a Germanic one, Old English, and renamed most of the place names in the country to English names. And they abandoned Christ in favour of pagan gods like Woden. But what is Anglo-Saxon paganism? There is a long-winded argument about what religion really means, and whether the traditions of the Anglo-Saxons and other kinds of Germanic paganism can be called a religion. But I won't go into that. Suffice to say that Anglo-Saxon paganism is the name I use to refer to the spiritual traditions of the early English people prior to their conversion to Christianity, and in this video I will refer to it as a religion, and you will understand what I mean when I do. Anglo-Saxon paganism did not die out in England with the coming of Augustine, or of Columba in the 6th century. Indeed, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom to accept Christianity was Sussex in the year 681 AD, although in reality most remained pagan after this, and as late as 700 AD, Guthlac referred to his heir Kissa as living among heathen people. The Anglo-Saxon elite traded their many gods for a foreign one, mainly in an effort to align themselves with their rich Christian neighbours among the Merovingian kingdoms. But the habit and force of tradition prevented the indigenous cults from disappearing entirely among the bulk of the population for some centuries after. Whenever anyone talks about this subject, the first thing they say is how little we know, how few sources on the subject survive. That is a truism which conceals the fact that many books have been written on the subject, and I have studied it for many years and am still learning. The main texts we rely on are Bældæg, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Lacnunga, and Beowulf. While the sources themselves are fragmentary and are subject to the distortions of the Christians who wrote them, they constitute an enormously revealing corpus when viewed in conjunction with other evidence, such as toponymy, archaeology, and most importantly of all, comparative mythology, namely Indo-European comparative mythology, which has proven the extraordinary persistence of certain myths which date at least as far back as the Neolithic. Since hardly anything of Anglo-Saxon mythology itself is preserved in written form, we rely heavily on medieval Icelandic literature and Scandinavian sources on Norse mythology to understand the early English religion. The Norse and the Anglo-Saxons were very closely related. Genetically they were both Nordic, but the Anglo-Saxons spoke West Germanic languages, and the Norse spoke North Germanic languages. These both descend from Proto-Germanic, which started to break up into different languages as the peoples migrated. We must conclude the Proto-Germanic religion also diverged with the languages, and therefore Norse religion was undoubtedly distinct from that of the Anglo-Saxons. However, their languages were mutually intelligible, and it is unlikely they recognized their traditions as separate religions the way we do. Rather, they simply understood that those folk do things differently over there. They understood that they worship the same gods, and wherever possible in this video I will explain how we can be certain of the correspondences between the equivalent Norse and English deities. So, I will look at both, and I will also refer to Roman sources, namely Tacitus, on the Proto-Germanic religious practices, since he specifically mentions a Germanic tribe called the Angli, who were the ancestors of the Angles, and therefore of the modern English people too. After discussing the gods in this video, which is part 1, I will also describe some of the other entities Anglo-Saxon pagans believed in part 2. These were less powerful, but were likely just as important, and for some people more important in terms of their daily practice and beliefs. Besides the gods and other entities such as elves, they would have worshipped their own ancestors. This custom is evident among the Norse, and is common to all Indo-European traditions, so must have existed among the Anglo-Saxons too. I won't devote a specific section of this video to ancestor worship, because the boundaries of this practice with others are very blurred, and in some cases the elves or even the gods were also regarded as ancestors. But please remember that for them, blood, lineage and kinship were of the utmost importance, not only socially, but also spiritually. That will become clear as you watch the video. One of the main obstacles for Christianity being accepted by the English was their deeply developed notions of kith and kin, and personal service to a lord or drichten. This was the bedrock of the Germanic society, and everybody identified themselves both in relation to their loyalty to blood relatives, and also to their drichten and his warband. These beliefs were fully integrated with their spiritual beliefs, and the divine hierarchies resembled the earthly hierarchy. It was necessary for Christ to be depicted as a drichten, and his apostles as Anglo-Saxon warriors, in order for the English to take the religion seriously. This should be remembered when we try to understand how they regarded the pagan gods. They called their gods Erce in plural, or Os in singular, and this is cognate with the name for the Viking gods, Aesir. The collective form Erce is only found in a 10th century poetic charm called Witfarstika, where they are invoked together with Ulfa, elves, and it is likely this was a formula dating back to pagan times, when the two groups of entities, elves and gods, were invoked for different purposes. So let's begin with the gods and what we know about them. Woden is the Old English name for the god the Norse called Odin. He is the best attested of all the English gods, but even so, we have to rely heavily on Norse sources to understand him. Woden's name derives from a root akin to Old English woth, meaning crazy or fury, which is cognate with Old Norse úðr, divine madness, and both come from Proto-Germanic wodas, meaning frenzied or raging, and give us the reconstructed name Wodenas, from which Woden and Odin derive. The German medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen wrote Wotan id est furor, Wotan, that is, the furious, showing that the original meaning of his name was still understood in 10th century Germany. Adam was actually using the German name of Wotan to describe the worship of Odin in Sweden, showing also that it was understood they were the same god. However, we can't be sure how different the cults of Odin and Woden became, since they are separated by so many centuries of divergence. Both gods were associated with hanging and with the number 9. In Hávamál, Odin sacrifices himself to himself by hanging on a tree for 9 nights. Adam of Bremen confirms this association when he reveals that every 9 years at Uppsala in Sweden, 9 males of each animal are hung from trees in the sacred grove as an offering to Odin. Likewise, Woden appears in a 10th or 11th century Anglo-Saxon healing charm preserved in the Lacknunga, which reads, Wyrm kom sneken, toslat vaja nam Woden neon Wulfheodenas,
Slow thar the nadran that hair on neon to flare. Thar yean da the apple and ator that hair nafrene wolda on husbayon. Filla and finula fella mitiu twa. Thar wurta ye shay up witty dreten, Harley on heafonum, thar he hungerde. Setta on sanda, on seofan worlda, earmum on eadium, ealum tobota.
This confirms Woden was a god who hung in the heavens like Odin, and of course we see the number 9 comes up again. Woden was also very important for Anglo-Saxon kings who needed to prove they were descended from him in order to make a legitimate claim to the throne. These royal genealogies all follow a similar pattern, with numerous legendary figures included, and with Woden consistently placed at 9 removes from the founder of a dynasty. Beda's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum was completed in 731 and lists the genealogy of Athelbert of Kent going back to the progenitor of the English race, Hengest, one of 2 divine horse twins who were in turn descended from Woden. He also says that many other English kings were descended from Woden, and the following century, when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was completed during the reign of Alfred the Great, we see that it contains many genealogies for the royal houses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which also include Woden as an ancestor. This was most likely a continuation of a pagan tradition in which kingship depended on a link to the divine, and Woden, like Odin, was a specifically aristocratic god, a god for the elite and the military. In Norway, the same thing happened, with the pagan reactionary Håkon Jarl claiming descent from Odin. But with Christianity, Woden was demoted from a god to a man in a process called euhemerization, and eventually the genealogies were extended back to include the biblical Noah as an ancestor of Woden. In the 10th century, Athelweard, an Anglo-Saxon nobleman, wrote that the heathen Anglo-Saxons made sacrifices to Oaddan regis barbarorum, Woden, the king of the barbarians, before battle, adding that Hengest and Horsa, the founders of that race, were Woden's grandsons. We can get an idea of what his cult looked like, not only from Norse sources, but also from the more closely related cult of Wodan on the continent. In the 7th century, Jonas of Bobbio records an encounter the Irish Saint Columban had with the Suebi in Germany, who were preparing a sacrifice of beer to their god named Wodan, but who others call Mercury. Similarly, in the 8th century, Paulus Diaconus, a historian of the Lombards, writes, Wodan, indeed, whom by adding a letter they call Godan, is he who, among the Romans, is called Mercury, and worshipped by all peoples of Germany as a god. In the 10th century, the Anglo-Saxon Alfric of Ensham, in De Falsis Dis, characterizes the hated god Mercurius as Suitha fankenful suikul on da doom, full of crime and treacherous in his deeds, and he is clearly referring to Woden as Mercury. These 3 medieval accounts agree with that of Tacitus in the 1st century, who equates the Germanic Wulfheodenas with Mercury. Nothing in the sparse evidence of the cult of Woden in England and Germany resembles what we know about Mercury, but if we accept that many of the mythic associations of the Scandinavian Odin were also present in earlier cults of Woden or Wotan in Germany and England, then it makes sense. Odin was a psychopomp, just like Mercury. And Mercury, who was the same as the Greek god Hermes, had become associated with an ancient Egyptian initiatic tradition too. He was said to have gifted hieroglyphics to mankind, just as Odin is said to have given the runes to mankind. And Hermes is a teacher who leads the way in an initiatic path for men to achieve divine knowledge, which is precisely what Odin does in Hávamál, where Odin describes the self-sacrifice he made in order to achieve sacred wisdom. If Woden didn't have these same initiatic associations as Odin, then we are at a loss to explain why, for so many centuries, everyone from Roman historians to English abbots and Irish saints connected his cult to that of Mercury. In English, Wednesday means Woden's Day, yet the French call it Mercredi, and in Italian it's Mercoledì, both meaning Mercury's Day. So make of that what you will. Another thing Woden had in common with Odin is his ability to bring inanimate objects, particularly idols, to life. The word træman, tree man, appears several times in Norse sources, referring to some kind of living wooden idol. One such idol is sent by pagan Håkon Jarl to kill his enemy. It was made from wood, but with a human heart placed inside it, and it was called Thorgarthr. Thorgarthr is referred to in a kenning as the Gauter of battle fire, and Gauter is a name for Odin. In Hávamál, a verse describes how Odin clothed 2 wooden men with the armour of noblemen, and in so doing turned them to demons of battle. The Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, who pretended that Odin was merely a man, still admitted that he had the power to make inanimate statues speak. It seems the Anglo-Saxons held similar beliefs, as it is said in the Old English gnomic poem Maxims 1 from the Exeter book. Woden horta hueos. Woden made idols. In Bældæg's account of the conversion of the Northumbrians, he describes how Coifi, the high priest of Dere in the early 7th century, declared the old religion a waste of time, rode a stallion to his own shrine at Gudmunum, and threw a spear at the altar of the gods. Henry Mayer Harting has suggested that this act may be a small but highly significant pointer to the cult of Woden and the knowledge of his mythology at this time. In a Norse source, Odin casts his sacred spear Gungnir over his enemies as a sign of war, the first war of men, in fact. Bældæg's account was clearly just anti-pagan propaganda, because if the high priest and the king had converted and burned the gods in temples, as he says, then the king's successors would not have reverted to paganism as though these events had never occurred, which is what they did. Yet the account of Coifi at the temple is so specific that it must have been so for a reason, likely that it was constructed specifically to insult the sensibilities of the faithful pagans. Bældæg explained that pagan priests of the sacred mysteries in England were not allowed to bear arms or ride a male horse, and Georges de Mézil's comparative religious studies corroborate this claim, showing similar prohibitions against priests bearing arms or riding horses in many other Indo-European pagan traditions. So Coifi's alleged actions broke deeply held and prehistoric religious taboos, because Coifi did both of these things. And the spear is a weapon that we may specifically connect to Odin, and therefore to Woden. Indeed, the name Coifi, which Bældæg wrote in Latin, may be a reference to Woden. It is not found anywhere else, and appears to be a noun, deriving with an I mutation from Latin cophium or cophia, meaning hood. Richard North wrote that Coifi was an early reflex of Frankish cophia, itself of Latin origin, and accepted into Anglian vernacular. One of the names for Odin in Norse sources is Grimnir, which means the hooded one, and he is also simply called Grim, meaning mask or hood. Both names refer to how Odin sometimes wanders the earth in disguise as a hooded old man. Place name evidence indicates the Anglo-Saxons also referred to Woden as grim. It is a name associated with eminent natural features in the English landscape, as well as ancient works thought to be supernatural. They conceived of Woden as the maker of great works beyond mortal power. Hence the great earthwork of northern Wessex, called Wonsdyke, from Woden's Dyke, belongs to the same tradition as the numerous ancient earthworks in southern England named Grimsdyke or Grim's Ditch. We also see a Bronze Age settlement on Dartmoor in Devon named Grim's Pound. Therefore, the hooded coiffy, renouncing the pagan religion, was intended by the author to look like Woden or Grim himself renouncing his own cult. There are many other places named after Woden in England too. In Kent they occur in the village names Woodnesborough near Sandwich and Wormshill near Sittingbourne. In Essex they used to exist in the ancient field names Wadnesfeld and Wednesfeld. The aforementioned Wonsdyke led from Wadnesdene, that's Woden's Valley, to Wadnesberg, which means Woden's Barrow, which is a Neolithic long barrow now known as Adam's Grave, after the biblical Adam. In the Midlands we have Wensbury and Wensfield, and up in Derbyshire a village called Wensley, Woden's Grove, and there is Wodenslawer, Woden's Barrow, in Bedfordshire. The wide distribution of his cult sites proves he was worshipped by Angles, Saxons and Utus. His cult was common to all. Some scholars, such as Kemble and Edric Holmes, claim that Old English wish, from which comes whist and wish, was a name for Woden. This would explain the so-called whist hounds of the Wild Hunt on Devon's Dartmoor, specifically at Wistman's Wood, which elsewhere in Europe are directly associated with Odin. And in Devon, all kinds of magical happenings are called wishtness, which may refer to Woden. This theory originates with Jacob Grimm, who notes that a certain Wulfheodenas, that is, Wish Lord, is attested in Dera and in Teutonic mythology. He writes, "We see Wish provided with hands, power, looks, diligence, art, blossom, fruit. He creates, shapes, produces masterpieces, thinks, bows, swears, curses, is glad and angry, adopts as child, handmaid, friend." He also says that Norse Oski is a name for Odin, which comes from Osk, which means wish. Among the Anglo-Saxons, the Proto-Germanic rune for the letter A, which we now refer to with the reconstructed name Ansus, split into 3 separate runes for different pronunciations of the letter. In Norse, the rune was known as Ors, which is related to Asir, and means pagan god. And the rune is explicitly associated with Odin in the Icelandic rune poem. One of the 3 English A runes is called Os, which also means pagan god, just like Norse Os. But despite this, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem interprets the word according to the Latin meaning of Os, which is mouth. This is obviously a Christian way of hiding the pagan meaning of the rune. One of the other English A runes is called Ash, as in ash tree, which is a tree associated with Odin because he hung himself from an ash tree, and also because spears were made from ash, and Odin was a god of spears. Therefore we can conclude both that the Os rune was associated with Woden in England, and also that Woden was associated with the ash tree, just as Odin was. This 6th century Anglo-Saxon sword from Faversham in Kent has a single ash rune carved onto the pommel, likely in an attempt to invoke Woden and gain his favour in battle. The archaeological record is in fact a rich repository of evidence for Woden's cult, specifically the items which Paul Mortimer termed wains, that is, Woden avatars in numerous environments. The argument that these and other depictions of a horned spear dancer pertain to a cult of Woden is too long to include in this video, but I have already made a separate video on the subject, so be sure to watch it. However, I will say that if accepted, the argument proves that Woden, like Odin, was associated with two ravens, and also with an ecstatic warrior cult relating to his name, meaning frenzy. The Norse storm god, Thor, was worshipped among the Anglo-Saxons as Thunor, which means thunder. The cult of this god is first attested by Tacitus, who calls him Hercules and identifies him with that Greco-Roman demigod by his attribute, the club. The Norse Thor also carried a bludgeoning weapon, but it wasn't a club, it was a short-handled hammer. However, it appears this hammer was originally a stone axe of the sort used in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. This one was buried with a tribal leader in Bush Barrow by Stonehenge over 4,000 years ago. Tacitus says that a forest in Germany was dedicated to Thunor, and we might assume this was an oak forest, because according to the 8th century Vita Bonifati Auctore Willibaldi, the Anglo-Saxon Christian missionary Saint Boniface cut down an oak which the Germans considered sacred to that god they called Thunor, which is cognate with the Old English Thunor and Old Saxon Thunir. Indeed, both oak trees and bludgeoning weapons are repeatedly found to be associated with the storm gods of various Indo-European religions. The Vedic Indra wields a Vajra. Roman Jupiter wields thunderbolts, as does the Greek Zeus, who is associated with oak trees. The Slavic storm god Perun wields an axe and is associated with oaks. Baltic Perkunas also has an axe and is associated with sacred oak trees. All of these gods, and some of their names, derive from the Proto-Indo-European dragon-slaying storm god Perkunos. Many of the aforementioned storm gods also slew dragons. In Norse myth, it is foretold that Thor will kill the world serpent at the end of the world, Ragnarok. We have no specific evidence connecting the Anglo-Saxon cult of Thunor to oak trees, nor do we have any myths about the god, such as the dragon-slaying myth. But these attributes are so ancient and so well preserved elsewhere, including among the Germanic cousins of the English on the continent and in Scandinavia, that it seems highly unlikely they didn't exist in England too. But archaeology proves he was associated with a hammer, just like Thor's Mjolnir. About 1,000 hammer amulets have been found in Britain and Scandinavia, which most scholars agree represent Thor's hammer. Although some sceptical people questioned if they even represented hammers at all, until 2014, when this one was found on the Danish island of Lolland with a runic inscription that says, "This is a hammer." The vast majority of these hammers all date to the Viking Age, and they all depict Mjolnir with a short handle, which corresponds to the Norse myth about a mistake in its creation causing it to be too short. In 1760, a number of weapon amulets were found in Gilton in Kent, which have been dated to the 6th century, Pagan Anglo-Saxon England, long before the Vikings arrived. The two hammers are unmistakably of the same shape as the later Viking Mjolnir amulets, but the handles are much longer, indicating that the myth about the short-handled defect did not exist in the English cult of Thunor. While Mjolnir pendants were worn about the neck, these English weapon amulets were worn at the hip. However, they seem to have served the same function, which is to protect the one who wears them from evil. This is very similar to an even older custom of wearing the club of Hercules as a protective amulet. These clubs were worn across the Roman Empire, including in Britain, during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. In the Old English dialogue of Solomon and Saturn, one line says, "Se Thunor hit threshed, midthara furanen Erce." This is not an invocation of Thunor himself. It is a Christian poem, but the association of Thunor, or thunder, with an axe is there, and hints at a memory of an early Germanic storm god whose weapon had not yet evolved into Thor's hammer. The axe is certainly more widely seen as a storm god's attribute elsewhere in Europe. What about other aspects of Thor? He was the son of Odin, had a red beard, and rode a chariot drawn by goats. None of this is attested for Thunor, though. We see all sorts of names listed as sons and descendants of Woden, but Thunor is never among them. It is possible he was also associated with goats and a red beard, but we don't know. He would certainly have been thought of as large and physically strong, just like all storm gods were, and it is this strength that attracted people to his cult. They wanted his protection from evil. Besides the 4th day of the week, Thursday, which we name after Thunor, there are many place names in England also named after Thunor. Thunoris Hlau, that is Thunor's Barrow in Kent, and Thunrus Lee near Southampton show he was worshipped in the regions the Utus settled. While in Saxon regions of England we find Thunrusfield near Hardenhush in Wiltshire, Thunrusleigh in East Hampshire. In Surrey we have Thunderfield near Reigate and the village of Thursley near where I grew up. While the East Saxons had Thunderley in North Essex and Thundersley in the south. There are also places in Sussex and Suffolk, but curiously there are no places named after Thunor in the regions of England in which the Angles settled. Tiw is the god from whom we take the name of the 2nd day of the week, Tuesday. His cult existed in Surrey, where we find the village of Tuesley, and also at Tysmere in North Worcestershire and Tyso in South Warwickshire. Some Saxon names also invoke this god, such as Teowulf, which means wolf of Tiw. The Norse version of Tiw is called Tyr, and he is a martial god of battle. Some people erroneously claim Tiw and Tyr were sky-father deities at some point, because their names are cognate with names for Indo-European sky-father deities, all deriving from Deus, as I explained in my video about the Sky Father. But Tyr was not a father god, nor was he associated with the sky. The name Tyr does not mean sky, it means god, and is used in kennings to refer to any god. It comes from an Indo-European root meaning sky, but neither Tiw nor Tyr mean sky. Woden is the Germanic sky father. The Norse myth about Tyr sacrificing his own hand by placing it in a wolf's mouth for the good of all the gods helps us to identify this Norse god in archaeological finds, like this bracteate from Sweden, which is dated to roughly the same time as the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain, or on this Viking-era hogsback grave from Sockburn in County Durham. But this was made by Vikings, not Anglo-Saxons. We have no idea whether the Anglo-Saxons preserved the same myth about Tiw, but the early dating of the bracteate makes it seem very likely they did. This Anglian bracteate from Norfolk dates to the 5th or 6th century and depicts a figure with a sword holding his hand in an animal's mouth. I think this is Tiw and the wolf, but others argue the beast looks more like a bird than a wolf. The runes don't give us much of a clue. They say wart or wat, which likely means liquid or drink. The Norse rune called Tyr is explicitly connected to the one-handed god in the Icelandic and Norwegian rune poems. There are also plenty of archaeological examples of the rune being used in a magical context on weapons and stones. One example is on the Malt runestone from Denmark, dated to about 800 AD. It includes a triple invocation of Tyr, which is also found as a runic formula elsewhere, such as on the Lindholm amulet, and it also calls upon Tyr to impose secrecy, presumably on the magic formula of the runes themselves. The face carved on the stone seems likely to represent the god himself. Old English sources give various names to the same rune. The earliest manuscripts call it T, while the 12th century Burtferth's manuscript calls it Tyr, perhaps due to Norse influence. Two sources call it Tyr, one of which is the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, but here it is said to refer instead to a star or planet rather than a god. Tu bith taknathsum, haildith trua well, with athelingus abithon faralda, offer nita yenithu, nafra swiketh. The names Ingween and Freyalaf both appear in Anglo-Saxon contexts, and are evidently referring to the same god known by the Norse as both Yngvi and Freyr, the former being his original name, and the latter a title, meaning lord. This epithet comes from Proto-Germanic Frøyas, and it appears in its Norse form in Old Norse compounds, such as Yngvi Freyr and Inguna Freyr, as well as in Old English Freya Ingwina, both of which mean Lord of the Ingwins. We can trace this deity back to Proto-Germanic times with the help of Tacitus, who divides the Germanic tribes into 3 lineages. The first are the Eriminones, shown in this map in yellow, who included the Suebi and the Angli, who are the same as the later Angles. According to the Frankish Table of Nations, written some 5 centuries after Tacitus, the Eriminones also included the Goths and the Saxons, and it says they all descended from a progenitor named Irmin, which seems to be another name for Wotan. The second are the Istevones, shown in orange, who the Frankish table says descend from Istio, and who included the Franks, Bretons and Alemanni. And the third are the Ingevones, to the north in red, who descend from Yngvi, and included the Jutis and the Saxons. The similarly named Yngveones are also listed as one of the 5 Germanic tribes by Pliny the Elder in his natural histories. So these 3 progenitors we can discern from the Frankish table and from Tacitus are likely all gods, and since the Anglo-Saxons descend from all 3 groups, it is likely they worshipped all 3 of them. But the worship of Yng is specifically attested in Old English literature, while the names Irmin and Istio are not. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem, despite being heavily Christianized, reveals that one of the runes was specifically devoted to this god, although he has been euhemerized to a mere ancestral hero. Yng was arest mid east denum, Yesawan sejum of he sithen east, offer way yawat, one after ran. Thus Heredingus thona hela nemden. In Norse mythology, Yngvi was a divine progenitor of a race of kings known in Sweden as the Yngling dynasty, while Freyr is a fertility god who rides a golden boar and whose cult was associated with horses. They are widely agreed to be the same god, since the 2 names are used in conjunction as a compound rendered as Yngvi Freyr, and the name Freyr isn't really a name, but a title meaning lord. Thus the Norse god's name was Lord Yng. The same compound is seen in English sources, as I already mentioned. In Beowulf we find the following. Gangva, after Flora Fordwortha, man mid his hand shala, hail wudu dunada, that he thona wisan wordom neada, freyan ingwina, freyan yifim wara, after neod latham, neat yatasa. Ingwin makes sense as an ethnonym because it means friends of Yng, like Ynglings means children of Yng, but it doesn't make sense that the Anglo-Saxons would call the god Yngwi unless the Proto-Germanic god's name was actually Ingus, which could become Old Saxon Ingwo or Old English Ingwa, which might somehow have become Ingwi. Or maybe the god's name changed from Ing to Ingwi in Old English because it was so often used in reference to the Ingween as a people. It is likely Tacitus's Ingveonis was a Latinization of Ingvinus, or another word meaning friend of Ing. Richard North has argued that Ingvi Frey was more important as a royal ancestral progenitor among the Anglo-Saxons than Woden was, and if that is true, then it would match up with the role of Yngvi in Sweden. Nothing at all survives of his mythic associations in English literature, but his Norse equivalent is attested in many myths and poems, and there are numerous places in Sweden and Norway named after him. Adam of Bremen says that his idol in Uppsala was represented with an erect phallus, and so this statuette found near Strängnäs in Södermanland, Sweden, is widely agreed to represent him. Perhaps the English depicted him in the same way. But even the Norse myths never actually describe him with an erection, so perhaps not. He is often described as a fertility god, because Icelandic sources say he was prayed to for peace and for good harvests, but he was not especially associated with crops. Rather, his principal aspect is that he was a lord, a divine ancestor. Snorri says he was the most renowned of the Aesir. He was explicitly associated with elves, as he was the lord of Alfheim. He was also associated with barrows. Indeed, he seems to have been the god of the noble dead of Barrows, who were themselves associated with elves too, as were the actual Barrows. Perhaps his most important myth is one in which he lusts after a girl called Gerthr, whose name means enclosure and which has religious connotations pertaining to sacred space, and who, after refusing his advances, Freyr seduces with magic. We know that he was seen among the English as an ancestor of noble lineages too, as the quotes in Beowulf and the English rune poem both show. Therefore, the connection to Barrows and elves is also likely. I'll explain in part 2 why Barrows, elves and ancestors are all connected. But we can't be sure the English associated Yngvi with peace or fertility or magical seduction. I have argued in my dissertation and my video on horse sacrifice that at least some of the numerous horse sacrifices and cremations found in Anglo-Saxon England pertain to the cult of Yngvi. The Old English goddess Frig is only attested in the name of the 5th day of the week, Frigadag, which became Friday. The Frisians named Friday after the same goddess, such that in Old Frisian they called it Friaday, from Frigendag. Her name is an exact cognate for the Norse goddess Frig, who is Odin's wife and a fertility goddess. It is also cognate with the German goddess named Freya, who is described as travelling with Wotan and helping him in a medieval magic spell called the Second Merseburg Charm. So it seems very likely the Old English Frig was the wife of Woden, yet she is not mentioned in any English sources, nor do place names attest to her worship. It is possible she was more widely known under another name, such as Erce. Erce is invoked in an Old English farmer's ritual called Akerbot, used to cleanse a cursed land and protect the harvest. It is a Christianized ritual, but includes an invocation of an evidently pagan deity who is called Mother Earth. Erce, 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 Earthen, Modra. Jacob Grimm connected the name Erce to Old High German Erken, genuine, true. It is clear that Erce was associated with the harvest, so we can reasonably associate her with the 9th month, which the Anglo-Saxons called Harli Monoth, holy month, because of the sacrifices the pagan English traditionally made at that time. It was also known as Harfestmånath, harvest month, so evidently these sacrifices related to the harvest. We know from Tacitus that the Germanic Angli, the 1st century ancestors of the English, worshipped the Earth Mother under the name Nerthus, and this cult evidently continued. He wrote that her idol was kept on an island, and during festivals it was conveyed by an ox-drawn wagon about the land, during which time all weapons and other metals were put away. Similarly, it was forbidden to bring metal objects into the holy groves of the Greek wild nature goddess Artemis. However, Erce seems to be a bit more similar to the Roman Ceres or Greek Demeter, both goddesses of crops, that is of tamed nature rather than wild nature like Artemis. In Norse sources, the most obvious parallel for Erce is Jörð, who is Mother Earth and the mother of Thor, but her epithet, Hlöðin, links her etymologically to the German goddess Hlöðina and the Old English goddess Hretha, as I shall explain later. Also, Jörð is not a harvest goddess like Erce, so perhaps better Norse equivalents could be found in Odin's wife Frig, or Thor's wife, Sif, but we cannot say with any certainty. The Kvineby amulet from the Swedish island of Öland contains a perplexing runic inscription which has prompted diverse interpretations. Two possible interpretations of the 143 runes were offered by Swedish runologist Ivar Lindqvist in the 80s, and both of them include an invocation of an earth goddess called Erce, fold, and Undergård, which means the god underneath, and fold is an epithet of the goddess Jörð, and Erce is obviously the same as English Erce. So, if Lindqvist was right, then Erce is definitely the same as Thor's mother Jörð, and some people, such as William Reeves, believe that Jörð is the same as Odin's wife, Frigg. We can be sure, however, that the cult of this English goddess endured even into early modern times. A German lawyer called Paul Hentzner, who travelled in England in 1598, witnessed a harvest festival in Windsor, where he says the people carried an idol of the goddess Ceres in a wagon. This matches a description from topographer William Hutchinson almost 200 years later in 1776, in which he describes how the people of Northumberland decorated an idol of Ceres with a crown of flowers and with harvested grain, and carried it out to the fields while playing music. Obviously, the English peasants were not worshipping the Roman goddess Ceres in the 16th or 18th century, but rather the English harvest goddess Erce, who was carried about in a wagon, just as Nerthus was by their ancestors in Germania 2,000 years ago. In De Temporum Ratione, Bældæg says that the Anglo-Saxons had a month called Hreithmånath, which is analogous to March, and that it is named after their goddess whose name he Latinized as Hretha, which is Hretha in Old English, meaning the famous or the victorious. Bældæg says that they sacrificed to her in this month, yet other sources reveal that there is an alternative name for this month, Hlöðamánath, from Hlöða, meaning loud, and this may also be an alternative name for the same goddess, Hretha. There are engravings from the 2nd and 3rd century in Germany and Holland naming a goddess called Hlöðina, which seems plausibly to descend from the same Proto-Germanic root as Hlöða, which is reconstructed as Hlöðas. Some argue that the victory goddess Hretha and her month were also named Hlöða in reference to the noisy winds of March, and this would explain the two alternative names for the month being derived from alternative names for the same goddess. With less certainty, others connect Hretha to Erce, based on a claim that Hretha is related to Hretha, a variant of Nerthus, who is attested in Tacitus, because Dutch, German and English all show evidence of metathesis, which is when consonants reverse positions within words without changing their meaning. But why would the harvest goddess be worshipped in March, unless she was known by different names in relation to different festivals? There is also an argument that connects Hludena or Hluda to Erce and also to the folkloric figure of Frau Holla or Frau Hulda, about whom the brothers Grimm collected many folk tales in Germany and who is to this day associated with various festive Christmas processions in Alpine countries. Some claim that Hludena means leader of the Hulda, that is the throng of demons. And this fits in well with the surviving tradition in which Frau Hulda, variously known as Frau Holda, Herke, Perchte, Berchte, and other names, accompanies hideous demonic creatures such as Krampus in the Christmas processions of the Alps. However, Holda is more widely agreed to relate to German Huld, meaning gracious, friendly, sympathetic, grateful, and that's cognate with Old English Huld, which means gracious, friendly, kind, favourable. Jacob Grimm tried to connect what he thought to be the first reference to Holda in an 11th century interpolation to the Canon Episcopi by Burchard of Worms to the pre-Christian Roman inscriptions to Hludana. The brothers Grimm also noted that the German regions where Frau Holda is absent are exactly the places where the similar figure of Perchte or Berchte appears, and that she was thought to be a white-robed goddess who oversaw spinning and weaving, as was Frau Holda in other Germanic regions. Another theory attempts to connect Holda and Hludana to the beautiful Hulda or Huldra of Scandinavian folklore. She is a seductive forest spirit whose name comes from Old Norse hulja, to hide. There is so much to go on, but so little we can say for certain in this case. If we accept the connection with Frau Hulda, then we are inclined to accept the following argument that she was a member of the Wild Hunt, which is generally associated with Odin or Wotan, and this may reinforce the argument presented by people like William Reeves that this is the same goddess as Odin's wife Frig. But even if the English goddesses Frigga, Erce, Hretha and Hluda are all derived from one goddess, that doesn't necessarily mean they hadn't split into separate goddesses by Anglo-Saxon times. Bældæg reveals that during the Yule season, the Anglo-Saxons worshipped figures known as the Mothers on a night called Modra, Night of the Mothers. Not much is said about what these mothers are. Whether they were gods or lower divine entities is not specified, yet we see possible parallels among the Norse and the Celts. Both Celtic and Germanic people in northwestern Europe worshipped figures which were known in Latin as the matris or metroni, and are usually depicted in threes, with Latin inscriptions on the continent containing both Celtic and Germanic names. The same figures were also worshipped by Romano-Britons. This idol comes from Bath in Somerset. The matris were offered sacrifices of incense, fruit, and pigs. It seems very likely that this is the same cult Bældæg was referring to among the Anglo-Saxons, and that these figures represented the ancestral clan mothers held in common by the tribe. Much like the Roman cult of the Lares, their worship cemented community bonds and ensured the collective prosperity of the clan. Bældæg tells us two seemingly contradictory things about the date of Modra. He says it was held on the night before Christmas, and that it signified the new year for the Angles. Now the first statement is impossible, because 24th December was determined at the time with the Julian calendar of the Romans, which of course the Anglo-Saxon pagans did not use. As I shall explain later, the Germanic heathen calendars were lunar-solar and determined primarily by the moon. Bældæg even says that the start of winter is determined by the full moon of Winterfuleth month. The closest parallel to Modra in Norse sources is called Disablot, which was a sacrifice for goddesses and other female entities held in Uppsala in Sweden at some point during the winter, perhaps at the start to coincide with the Winter Night's blot, which signified the new year for the Norse, or perhaps later on. If Modra was the Anglo-Saxon pagan New Year, then it ought to have been on the full moon of Winterfuleth. But Bældæg never makes this connection, instead specifying a later date close to Christmas. So perhaps it was on the full moon of December, or perhaps it was on the night before the winter solstice, which would explain why Bældæg said it was on Christmas Eve specifically. It was certainly in one of the 2 months of Yule, which correspond to our modern December and January.
Hengest Horsa, Hengest Horsa.
As soon as the USA adopted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, a committee was formed to create a seal for the new country. John Adams proposed an image of Hercules, while Benjamin Franklin wanted to use Moses. But Thomas Jefferson argued that it should include Hengest and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honour of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Unfortunately, this seal was rejected. These Anglo-Saxon gods had long been revived as symbols of Saxon, and therefore English and American identity, since the 17th century, when these images were created, although they were not understood as gods at the time, since the medieval sources describe them as men. Hengest and Horsa are 2 twin brothers whose names mean stallion and horse. Bældæg wrote that Hengest and Horsa were the great-great-grandsons of the god Woden, but that they were the first Anglo-Saxon chiefs to lead the invasion of South Britain. An alternative narrative depicted in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as well as in Welsh sources by Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth, says that the twins were in fact mercenaries invited by the Celtic king Vortigern to assist him in fighting the Picts. Eventually they brought more men over and took over the country. This reading is from the Chronicle for the year 449 AD. Her Martianus and Valentinius, Orfengen Richa and Riksorden sea von Winter, and on here dagum Hengest and Horsa, from Wirt Jerna, Jelathoda, Bretta Kuninga, Jesoten Brettena on tham steder, there is Jenemid Upwinnes Fleot, arrest Brettum to Fultuma, ac hi eft on hi futen, so Kuning het hi feoten on eon peotes, and hi swaduden, and siga hafton swahwar swahi common. He tha senden to Angla, and heton him senden Marenfulten. Tha senden he him Marenfulten. Tha common tha men of Thrim Maithum, Germani, of Eild Seaxum, of Englum, of Eotum. Geoffrey also added an interesting story about King Vortigern marrying Hengist's daughter, Rowena, who introduces him to the traditional Germanic wassail toasting tradition. This narrative is not really historical, and more likely represents a symbolic account of how the Anglo-Saxons integrated with the native Britons. There are also brief mentions of a warrior named Hengest in Beowulf, and an Old English poem contained on the Finnsburg fragment. The Welsh accounts were likely based largely on Bældæg and the Chronicle, which had already euhemerized the 2 gods. There are also several Dutch accounts of the twin brothers Engistus or Eugistus and Horsus, dating to the 15th and 16th centuries, which are likely based largely on the much older English and Welsh sources, but also differ in certain ways. There are actually 2 sets of twins by these names in Dutch sources. Both are said to be Frisians, one pair living in the 4th century and another in the 5th century. The former are said in some sources to have journeyed to Rome in 372, where they met Emperor Valentinian to learn noble manners. He apparently loved them, which is implausible since he went to war against Germanic tribes to defend Britain, and also he was very opposed to pagans. In some of these Dutch sources, the brothers go to Brittany rather than Britain, to serve under Vortigern, and they are variously described as having worshipped Woden or Mercury. It is likely derived from a native Dutch tradition of Hengest and Horsa as progenitors of the Frisians, which has been corrupted in Christian times and also influenced by British literature about the same twins, whose story was again modified to suit Dutch Christian tastes. None of the English, Welsh or Dutch sources describe them as gods, but we can tell for sure that they were. The divine horse twins are two of the most reliably reconstructed deities of the Proto-Indo-European religion practiced on the steppes of Eastern Europe in the Neolithic. They were the sons or grandsons of the Sky Father god. In India, they became the Ashvins of the Rig Veda, while in Greece they became the Dioscuri, Zeus's boys, called Castor and Polydeuces. Tacitus wrote that the Germanic tribe called Nehalennia venerated the Alkis, a pair of god he identifies with Castor and Polydeuces, and whose cult he says was maintained by a male priest dressed in women's clothes. The Alkis Tacitus describes are very likely to be an earlier version of Hengest and Horsa, who are not only twins named after horses, but are descended from the Sky Father, Woden. In other Indo-European traditions, the horse twins marry the daughter of the sun goddess, but that myth is not preserved in any Germanic tradition. Bældæg reduced the pair to mere mortals in an effort to rationalise an Anglo-Saxon tradition of claiming descent from Woden via the divine horse twins. I talk in more detail about these divine twins in my video on the Indo-European Sky Father. Nehalennia is not attested in any Anglo-Saxon sources, but it is very likely she was worshipped by them in some form. Her cult is attested in the form of dozens of votive images dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, mainly from the Netherlands. She seems to have been a goddess of maritime trade from the Netherlands to Britain and Scandinavia. Like the Matris, her cult was very Romanized. There is some dispute over whether she was Celtic or Germanic in origin, but the name seems to be Latinized Low German. She is often depicted with a boat or holding an oar. In some images she is seated, accompanied by a dog and carrying a basket of apples or baked loaves, suggesting she may be a regional variant of Erce or some such Earth Mother. In other images she is shown with two other goddesses, just like the Matris or Matranae. A sea god sometimes appears on the sides of her altar, or separately, carrying a dolphin and armed with a trident, like the Greek Poseidon. What we are seeing is a highly syncretic cult of a native goddess which was formalized under Roman rule, where it was centered in the Netherlands prior to the migration of Frisians from that region to Britain with the Anglo-Saxon invasion. It is almost inconceivable that the Frisians did not continue to worship her in England, particularly since they already would have associated her with British trade. Wada, who later became Wade, was a water god. In 1703, Trogilus Arnkiel wrote that the Frisians worshipped the gods Forseta, or Foster, and Wada. As I've said, the Frisians were one of the ancestral tribes of the Anglo-Saxon migrations, so it is no surprise we see English evidence of the cult of this god. The first mention of this sparsely attested figure is found in the Old English poem Widsith, where he is listed among many rulers, both legendary and historical. Casera Wayld Creacum, und Calic Finum, Hagena Holmrugum, und Heodum glommum, Wita wailed swafum, Wada halsingum. So this poem euhemerizes Wada, making him a king in Hälsingland, Sweden. This happens a lot in medieval Christian literature, which seeks to neutralize the gods by reducing them to mere men, although great men. The only other Old English reference to Wade is known from a tiny excerpt quoted in Latin in a homily from a medieval manuscript. These lines were supposedly spoken by Wade in the lost Tale of Wade. Some are elves, some are adders, and some are knickers that dwell near water. There is no man except Hildebrand alone. Knickers are Germanic water spirits, also known as necks. I'll talk more about them in part 2. It is believed Wade has listed these water-based creatures with which he has contended, but the fragment is hard to interpret. In the Icelandic Thidrik saga, we find a Norse cognate for Wada who is called Vaði. It says he was the son of King Vilkinus and a mermaid, thus reinforcing the connection with water. There is another hint that he was a god in the fact that he is named as the father of Völundr, the blacksmith of the Norse gods, and he had an Anglo-Saxon equivalent named Wayland, who I will get to later in this video. Wade also makes an appearance in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Merchant's Tale, with specific reference to his boat. And bet than old Buff is the tender of eel, and eke these are old woodwas, God it woot, they conna so muchel craft on Wada's boot, so muchel broken harm, one that hem Leicester, that with him shoulder I never a liver in rester. Thomas Spate, who edited that text over a century after it was written, remarked that this boat was called Gwingelot, which Walter Skeat reconstructs in Old English as Wingelock. Both Chaucer and Spate allude to Wade in such a way that assumes widespread knowledge of the figure and his legend among readers. But alas, this knowledge has been lost. Place name evidence for his cult can be found in Mulgrave near Whitby, where some stones are referred to as Wada's grave, and also at Wade's Causeway on the North Yorkshire moors. A famous Neolithic long barrow in Oxfordshire is named after the god Wayland, as I explained in the film From Runes to Ruins. The long barrow was named Wayland Smithy by the Anglo-Saxon Pagans, in honour of Wayland, the legendary blacksmith of the gods. The legend of Wayland the Smith is recounted to us in Nordic myth, where he is named Völundr. The story goes that Wayland's wife, the swan maiden Hervor, leaves him with only a ring to remember her by. His bad luck continues when he is enslaved and crippled by King Nithad, and then imprisoned on an island where he is forced to work the king's forge. His beloved ring is given to the king's daughter, Bodvild.
Eventually, Wayland gets his bloody revenge, killing the king's sons, fashioning goblets from their skulls, jewels from their eyes, and a brooch from their teeth. His vengeance is complete when he takes his ring back from Bodvild, then rapes her, and leaves her pregnant with his child. There is a carving of the crippled Wayland on a Saxon casket on which Wayland and a runic riddle are strangely juxtaposed against a nativity scene. He is also mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon poem Deor.
Wayland him be worme, retches kunnede, an hudde eir forthar dreig, hafde him to Jesitha, sorge und longeth, winter kealda retche, wayan oft on fond, sithen
Hina nithad on neda leda, swankra seon benda on Sulenman.
So it is clear the myth of Wayland being imprisoned by Nithhad existed among the Anglo-Saxons as well as the Norse, and we have depictions of this scene both on the English Frank's casket and on this Gotland picture stone where Volander is working the forge. But only the Norse sources preserve the part of the story where Volander or Wayland escapes Nithhad by building artificial wings. And there is also this marvellous archaeological find from Upokra depicting Volander with his wings. In Norse myth, Volander is famous for forging the legendary sword Gram, used by the hero Sigurdr to slay the evil dragon Fafnir. He is also depicted as the creator of legendary weapons and armour in Old English literature too. He is said to have forged the mail shirt worn by Beowulf in that epic poem, and the hero's sword in the Old English poem Waldere. Wayland even appears in English literature long after the Anglo-Saxon era. For example, in Arthurian legend, the Celtic king Rhydderch gave a sword forged by Wayland to the wizard Merlin. He is never specifically referred to as a god, and in the Norse poem Völundakvíða, he is called the ruler of elves, indicating he himself was an elf. But even if this is so, it would not preclude him from being a god too. Certainly, in England, the gods and elves are invoked together as Erce and Ulfr, showing a connection, and among the Norse, the god Freyr was said to abide in the land of Ulfr, that is elves, where he was lord, indicating the gods were closely connected to the elves. There are also many other Indo-European blacksmith gods, such as Greek Hephaestus and Slavic Svarog. So it is likely the English had one too. While most of the royal Anglo-Saxon genealogies all lead back to the god Woden via other gods, all of whom are euhemerized by Christians, the Essex king lists lead back to another figure, Seaxneat, who is undoubtedly a god. He is also attested on the continent in an Old Saxon baptismal vow, which requires the new Christian to renounce not only the devil, but also Thunor, Woden, and Seaxneat, and all their followers. Seaxneat is clearly the Old Saxon cognate of Old English Seaxneat, and the first part of this god's name refers to the seax, which is a short sword favoured by Germanic warriors, and after which the Saxons were named. If Seaxneat wasn't an epithet or alternative name for another deity, then that's all we know about him. But many scholars think it was. Some say he is Tiw, simply because Tiw was associated with swords. We see his rune carved onto them as some kind of magical charm. A seax is a sort of sword, but the link is tenuous. More people believe Seaxneat is another name for Yngvi. In Norse sources, the only two gods which function as divine ancestors of kings are Odin and Freyr, so it seems likely that the one exception from Anglo-Saxon king lists, where Woden is not the ultimate ancestor, would be a name for Yngvi. Additionally, the invocation of a divine Saxon triad, Thunor, Woden, and Seaxneat, strongly resembles the Norse triad of gods that the German medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen says were worshipped at the temple of Uppsala in Sweden, Thor, Wotan, and Frigg, by which he meant Thor, Odin, and Freyr. Strangely, no place names in England attest to the worship of Seaxneat, not even in Essex. In De Temporum Ratione, Beda writes that the month which English Christians called Paschal month, what we now call April, was known by heathens as Eostre Moneth, after the goddess Eostre. Ironically, while most European nations, including the Nordic countries, have named Easter, the festival, with some variant of Pascha or Pashka, which derives ultimately from Hebrew Pesach, meaning the Jewish Passover feast. The English have reverted back to the pagan name of Easter. This must have happened after Bældæg's time, which indicates the cult of this goddess lingered on. Some fundamentalist Christians incorrectly state that this is the only attestation of the goddess, and even that Bældæg made her up, which is far from true, nor would he have any reason to do so. Jacob Grimm wrote in 1835 that Germans referred to Easter as Ostermonat and Ostermonath, and records Old High German references to the goddess as Ostara, which is cognate with Eostre, both deriving from Proto-Germanic Austron. These names are cognate with the names for goddesses of the dawn in several Indo-European religions, including Latin Aurora, Greek Eos, Baltic Eostre, and Vedic Ushas in India. In Ireland, Bridget, a goddess of spring, was associated with the Beltane fire ritual. Her name is derived from Proto-Celtic Briganti, meaning the High One, which is cognate with Sanskrit Brahti, meaning high, which is an epithet for the goddess of the dawn, Ushas. So the names all point to a very ancient dawn goddess. We also have more evidence that she was a real goddess in the form of over 150 Latin inscriptions found in Morkenharf near Berkheim in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany, dating to the 2nd century and referring to the Matronae Austriacenae. These figures may be a local variant of the matres or mothers mentioned earlier. There are also place names that may attest to her worship in England, such as Austerfield in South Yorkshire and Eastre in Kent. The dawn goddess seems to have been one of the most important in the Indo-European mythology, and Ushas is by far the most invoked goddess of the Rig Veda. With so many well-attested cognate goddesses of the dawn, we might venture a guess at the attributes by which this Eostre was known. Unfortunately, we have no Norse goddess with a cognate name. But there is a strong argument that the Norse goddess Freyja is in fact the mythological cognate. Her name is an honorific, meaning lady, which indicates she had another name unknown to us. She is known for being sexual, beautiful, is accused of promiscuity, and her attribute is her necklace, Brisingamen. Similarly, Eos and Aurora were said to be beautiful, and each had multiple lovers. In many Indo-European traditions, the dawn goddess is connected to the horse twin gods. The Baltic sun goddess's chariot is drawn by the Djevedeli twins, and Ushas is the sister of the Ashvin twins. Dumezil theorized that in Norse religion, the horse twins morphed into the father and son pair of Freyr and Njordr, and of course, Frey's twin sister is Freyja, which again connects her to the dawn goddess. Many of these dawn goddesses are also associated with gold and treasure, and also having tears made of gold or amber. Likewise, Freyja cries tears of red gold for her missing husband. There are many more aspects to this argument, which were covered in a long live stream I did on the subject with 2 guests. If you want to learn more, watch it. But it is very odd that Freyja is not attested as an Anglo-Saxon goddess, and also that Eostre has no cognate among the Norse. So, when taking all the other Indo-European evidence into account, I think it's very likely they are the same figure. Once we accept that Eostre was a dawn goddess associated with sexual promiscuity, like Freyja, and also with the spring, it seems inevitable that the very pagan May Day celebrations found across Germany and England were originally related to her cult. Even today, there is strong sexual imagery in the form of a young virgin called the May Queen, who is paraded about like a goddess, as well as the obviously phallic symbol of the maypole. more overtly sexual aspects to May Day were preserved until recent centuries. In 1583, the Puritan Philip Stubbs recorded that of the girls who spent the May Day Eve in the woods, scarcely the third part of them returned home again undefiled. Grimm also wrote about certain German traditions in which maidens clothed in white, who, at Easter, at the season of returning spring, show themselves in clefts of the rock and on mountains, which he says is suggestive of the ancient goddess Eostre. Please see my video on May Day and its connection to Easter for more information on that. Bældæg is attested in Anglo-Saxon genealogies as the son of Woden. He is often argued to be the English cognate of the Norse god Baldur, who is Odin's most beloved son, and is killed by a mistletoe dart through a wicked scheme of the trickster god Loki. This connection often depends on both names stemming from the Proto-Germanic theonym Balthras, meaning hero or prince. But this is disputed by scholars such as Richard North, who says Baldur is a cognate with Old English Bældor, which means prince or hero, and is very distinct from Bældæg as it appears in the regnal lists of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where it literally means pyre day. The earliest surviving cognate of Old English Bældor and Norse Baldur appears in a 3rd or 4th century inscription from Roman Utrecht. Here we see the names of a Germanic god, Baldrus, and a Celtic god, Lobonus, are used as epithets for the Greco-Roman demigod Hercules. The word Baal, on the other hand, is related to our modern word Baal, and refers to the fire of a pyre, like the one used in Baldur's funeral from Norse mythology. And the word is also cognate with the Celtic word Belo, from which derives the bell part of the Celtic spring festival, Beltane, thought to derive from Proto-Celtic Belotanos, meaning bright fire, in reference to the fires the Celts lit for that holy festival. Celtic Belo and Old English Baal both derive from a Proto-Indo-European word bel, meaning shine or gleam or white. The earliest reference to Beltane comes from a medieval Irish glossary, Sanas Cormac, written about 900 AD. It says the festival is named after the fire of a god called Bel, and that a fire was kindled in his name at the beginning of summer always, and cattle were driven between the two fires. This proves the Irish not only had a fire ritual, but also a specific god after whom it was named, variously called Bel or Belinus, and it is likely this god has Indo-European roots, as we also see a Slavic equivalent called Belobog, meaning the white god. Bældæg's name means pyre day, which sounds a lot like Beltane, which is a fire day, and the first part is cognate with the Celtic and Slavic gods, so it seems Bældæg descends from the same Indo-European fire god. But that doesn't mean that Bældæg is not also the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of Norse Baldur. The famous German folklorist Jacob Grimm found a cognate for the Celtic Beltane in the German words Pultag and Pulletag, which refer to a similar festival celebrated on the 2nd of May. Grimm reckoned these names both derived from Old High German Voltag, which can mean Bale Fire Day, just as Bældæg and Beltane do, but which also specifies a god named Fol, who we also see is invoked alongside 3 other gods in a 10th century German magic spell called the Second Merseburg Charm. Fol and Woden were riding to the woods, and the foot of Baldur's fall was sprained. So Sinthgund, Sunna's sister, conjured it, and Freya, Vola's sister, conjured it, and Woden conjured it as well he could. Like bone sprain, so blood sprain, so joint sprain, bone to bone, blood to blood, joint to joints, so may they be glued. Both Balder and Fall are named, but these are generally agreed by Grimm and most scholars since to refer to the same god. We can also connect the fire god Bældæg with the Norse Baldur using the start of the Prose Edda, which specifies that Odin's son is called Bældæg, who the Norse call Baldur, and it goes on to say that his son was called Brand, as in firebrand, and this is the same name given to the son of the Anglo-Saxon Bældæg in the king lists, therefore revealing the connection of Baldur to fire existed among the Norse too, and that these are indeed the same god. But how similar were they? Baldur's myth is centered around his death, which causes all the world, gods, men, and all entities to lament. The only fire in Baldur's myth is his funeral pyre. Yet we do see some hints of an association of the English Bældæg with a sad demise. There is a story told within Beowulf of two brothers, Herebeald and Hrathcun, who are involved in a tragic accident that results in Herebeald's death. There is an etymological relationship between Herebeald and Baldur, and we also see that Herebeald's father is said to descend into a rage as though his son had been hanged, which is an Odinic death. It isn't certain, but the two stories bear enough resemblance that they could derive from a common source. More evidence connecting Bældæg to the Norse Baldur myth comes from his connection to Christ. The words Theoda Baldur, the Prince of Races, are used to refer to Christ in the Anglo-Saxon poem Andreas, and in another poem, The Dream of the Rood, which is preserved both in manuscript form and carved in runes on the Rathwell cross. The death of Christ is said to have caused all of creation to weep. Weop Eal Yesheaft. Just as in the story of Baldur's death, Hel, the goddess of the underworld, promises to release Baldur if everything in the world, living and dead, weeps for him. Indeed, some scholars claim that the Norse Baldur myth itself was influenced by the myth of the death of Christ, although they are very different, and I certainly don't think this is the case. Richard North has also argued that the Baldur myth was popular in Anglo-Saxon England prior to the Viking Age on the basis that the phrase Woppus Hring, circle of weeping, was frequently used in Old English poems and seems to refer to this motif of the world weeping. Scyld is another figure who is never actually referred to as a god, but I am certain he was one. His name means shield. In Norse sources he is called Skjöldr, which also means shield, and he is described as a mortal prince. However, in these same accounts, other gods like Odin are also said to be mortal men. Scythians, in fact, and in both Skildunga Saga and the Ynglinga Saga, Skjöldr is said to be the son of Odin and the brother of Yng. Odin leaves Sweden to Yng, where he founds the Yngling dynasty, and Denmark to Skjöldr, where he founds the Skildungs. Here, as elsewhere, Christians euhemerize progenitor gods, and in so doing preserve evidence of the pagan tradition of claiming descent from the gods. Evidently Scyld was considered a divine ancestor among the Anglo-Saxons too. In Beowulf, the Skildings are referred to as the Scyldings, a line to which the king Hrothgar of the Danes belongs, and Scyld is called Scyld Schefing, that is, Scyld, descendant of Shef, which means sheaf, who is another Anglo-Saxon god, or perhaps the same one. No mention is made of his relation to Woden, but rather we learn that he was a foundling. He washed up on a Danish shore as a baby, born by a shield, but grew up to become a great king. This myth bears an obvious resemblance to the myth of baby Moses being sent down the river in a basket, and could therefore be explained by Christian influence on the Germanic people, except for the fact that there is also a clear parallel in the Hindu Mahabharata too. The demigod Karna is the son of Surya, the sun god, and a mortal woman, Kunti. Since she was unmarried, Kunti had to abandon baby Karna, so she set him adrift in a basket on a river on which he floated to Bengal, was adopted by people there, and grew up to become a great warrior, and the founder of the city of Karnal. The Mahabharata text in its current form dates to the 4th century before Christ, with some older parts composed as early as the 8th or 9th century BC. No references to Moses appear in any Egyptian sources prior to the 4th century BC, and historians do not believe Moses was even a real person. The influence of Iranic mythology on Jewish mythology could explain the Moses as foundling myth, and modern genetic science has proven Ashkenazi Jews do have some DNA from the Persians. In that case, the baby foundling god is a myth of Indo-European origin, and Scyld is the English version of him. To reinforce this theory, we also have the Greek myth of how the baby Perseus, who would one day found Mycenae and the great Perseid dynasty, was set adrift on the sea in a chest with his mother. Thanks to the intervention of Zeus, Poseidon calmed the waters, and they were rescued by a fisherman called Deuctis. Once again, we see the water as the bringer of a baby who is to be the progenitor of a great race, and who is affiliated with the sky father deity. Skjöldr may be connected to the Norse god Ullr, whose ship is said in Skjoldskaparmál to have been a shield. The name Ullr is cognate with Old English Wuldur, meaning glory, but no English god by that name is attested. The Anglo-Saxon account of Scyld is confusing because he is descended from a hero, or god, named Sceaf, who appears to have a very similar origin myth. Both Æthelweard in his Chronica and also William of Malmesbury's 12th century chronicle say that Sceaf arrived as a boy to the island of Scandinavia, where he was adopted by locals and eventually chosen as king and founded a dynasty, making him the ancestor of the kings of Wessex, according to Æthelweard, and of the Angles, according to William. However, the Old English poem Widsith says that Sceaf was the progenitor of the Lombards, and it is worth noting that prior to their migration into Italy, the Lombards were likely to have been neighbours of the Angles. The exact relation between Scyld and Sceafa varies in different genealogies, but it is evident that the Scefings and the Scyldings are the same dynastic line. One of the intermediary ancestors between the two is called Heremod, whose name is cognate with the Norse god Hermodr, who is the son of Odin. Clearly the two figures were once gods, who somehow came to share the same origin myth about being a baby foundling, and perhaps that is because they were once the same god. William of Malmesbury says that Sceaf was so named because he was set adrift with a handful of corn at his head, hence sheaf, as in sheaf of corn. This hints at an association with fertility and prosperity, important virtues for a king or a god from whom kings descend. There is even tantalizing evidence at an associated ritual in medieval Oxfordshire. It was used by a monastery in Abingdon for resolving land disputes and required a sheaf of wheat to be placed on a round shield with a lighted candle and set adrift on the River Thames. The movement of the shield determined who owned which land, and this indicates that the myth of this progenitor god and the claim of descent from him was also used to justify claims of land ownership. Sigel is the sun goddess, whose cognate in Old High German was Sunna, and in Old Norse was Sol, who drives the sun's chariot through the sky each day, chased by wolves. The goddess is not properly attested in English, but she has the seventh day, Sunday, named after her, as well as the Sigel rune. Sigel se manum sumbul bithon hyte, Thunor hi hina ferjeth offer fishes beth, of hi brim hengest bringeth to lande. There is some question as to whether the sun was worshipped as a goddess, but it is certain the sun was worshipped. The abbot Ælfric of Ensham wrote about 1000 AD that the earlier Anglo-Saxons would worship as gods the sun and the moon because of their shining brightness, and that they offered them sacrifice and forsook their creator, which refers to the Christian Jewish God. Archbishop Wulfstan, writing between 1016 and 1035, wrote that it shall be heathenry that a man would worship an idol, which is that a man should worship heathen gods, and the sun or moon, fire or flood, wellspring or stones. So the former states the sun was worshipped as a god, while the latter distinguishes the sun and moon from the gods, and says they were all worshipped. The Old English god named Earendel has a Norse cognate called Aurvandil, who is said in Skald Skaparmál to have gotten frostbite while carrying the god Thor through cold rivers, and that Thor had then pulled off the frost-bitten toe and cast it into the heavens, where it became a star which the Norse called Orvandil's Tor, Orvandil's toe. We can identify this star as Venus by looking at the English sources for Earendel. Earendel comes from Proto-Germanic ausi, meaning dawn, so the reference to dawn may connect this god to Eostre, the dawn goddess. Christ I, also known as Christ A, is a fragmentary collection of Old English poems dated to the 9th century, and in which the name Earendel is given to Christ himself, and the poem is itself based on a 6th century antiphon called O Oriens, which is sung during Advent close to the solstice, and in which the wandering dawn star is addressed as Venus. Elsewhere, Earendel is used to refer to St. John the Baptist as one who comes before Christ, and this might reflect an earlier belief in the god Earendel coming before the dawn goddess, just as Venus is called the morning star because it shines so brightly and is the last to disappear before the sun rises. Erla Earendel, engla beortust, offer midden jerd, monum sended, ond sothfasta sonnen leama, tort offer tunglas, thu tida Joanna, of sulfum the simla in Hlitis. The pagan calendar of the Anglo-Saxons. We can get an idea of the pagan year of the Anglo-Saxons from Bede's De Temporem Ratione, written about 725, under a section titled De Mensibus Anglorum, on the months of the English. More hints are seen in the Old English Martyrology, written between 800 and 900 AD, Ælfric of Ensham's De Temporibus Anni, written around 1005, Burtferth's Old English Enchiridion, written between 1010 and 1012, and the Old English Menologium, written between 1044 and 1066. Bældæg wrote, "The English folk of olden days reckoned their months by the begoing of the moon. As with the Hebrew and the Greek, the months took their name from the moon. Thus, as they named the moon, Morna, so they named the month, Morneth." He says that they reckoned their months beginning by the new moon, which was determined by the first visible crescent of the moon after conjunction with the sun. Therefore, they did not have the same calendar we have at all, and this makes it difficult to place their holy days onto our calendar. This matches up with the theories of the Swedish archaeologist Andreas Nordberg, who determined that the Norse did not have a solar calendar, as some claim, but a lunar solar calendar. It seems clear that the same was true for the Anglo-Saxons. Bældæg also reveals that they did not have 4 seasons as we do today, but rather divided the year into 2 halves, like the Celts did, the dark winter half and the light summer half. He wrote that the first month of the winter year is called Winterfulleth, which was close to our October, but that the actual winter begins on the full moon of that month, and it is likely a sacrifice was held on this night. There is a clear Norse equivalent mentioned in legendary sagas called Vetrnatter, or Winter Nights, which occurred on the first 3 nights of winter, and this matches with a description from Ynglinga Saga by Snorri Sturluson, which says that one of the 3 great sacrifices of the year occurred at the start of winter for a good year. I cannot provide you with an accurate calendar of all the days of the Anglo-Saxon pagan year because we simply can't calculate them accurately based on what evidence we have. But we know that whenever Bældæg or anyone else tries to place them according to dates on the modern calendar, that they're wrong because they did not use our modern calendar.
So now you know what the pagan gods of the Anglo-Saxons were like, and you know what their pagan calendar was like. Join me again in part 2, where we'll look at some of the other entities that they revered and feared, such as elves, orcs, and ents.
Do take a look at some of my other videos on ancient Indo-European religions, genetics and folk customs if you want to learn more. And don't forget to hit subscribe and the notifications bell. You can also access exclusive private videos which I make just for patrons if you sign up for either Patreon or Subscribestar for as little as the price of a pint per month. The links for these are in the description. If you support me, you will be ensuring this channel continues to survive and celebrate ancient European history for years to come. So thank you so much.